Writing good and reliable code for your networking requests can be a challenge, and I'm going to show you some ways to improve this. I'm going to use two different things. First, I'm going to talk about URL components, how we can construct URLs with different search queries. And then the other part is how we can write an extra service layer for the network and make some of this stuff a little bit more reusable so we get all the important information, but don't repeat ourselves and have it very clear for the different areas of our application. This is the second part of a series where I built an app with the iTunes Search API. You can now see how far I actually got. This is the main part of the app. I have here a search text field and some buttons. This is the empty state. I can tap on one of these buttons and I can type here. And you see I have a list of things coming up. This is also continuously loading more if I scroll further. One problem that I have not, there's actually a bug, and that is that I didn't format my search terms for the URL properly. For example, if I use now a space, it's not giving me anything. That's because, well, I didn't construct a proper URL. Let's have a look at how to properly do this. I'm now here on the Search API examples page, and instead of an empty space, this has to be replaced by a plus sign. Now, I don't really want to do all of this formatting myself. I like to have something convenient that already uses the proper way for these URLs. And that's why I'm going to use the URL component system that Swift provides. Project that I built so far. Okay, let's have a look at what I actually did to create this mess. So this is in the album list view model where I created this URL. And here I basically added the search term to the string, which means that I added here this spacer directly. I'm going to use here a breakpoint so we see if I actually were able to create a URL with this. So again, this is for the case of not having an underbar. So I'm just going to go step further, or step in, and I'm going to go and continue because I have a URL. So this is working. Now I'm just going to press here the play button. And I'm going to now tap the spacer. Okay, so now I have KL and space. I step in, and indeed it's actually not able to generate a proper URL from this. And I return early, so that's why I never start a URL request and I never see any data, which is bad. So we have to rethink this. And the easiest way is to use this component system. Just going to stop the app. So let's create a function where I can start this. And maybe I'm going to copy one of the examples. This is more so I see it directly, so for you to see it directly and for me. So on the very end of my view model, I'm just creating a function. Create URL for search term. We can also use more properties. Okay. When you look at this, the composition of these URLs, this is for search term being of type string. Forgot the most important part. Now looking at the way this URL is constructed, this starts with the base URL. Then there's the endpoint, and in our case it's the search endpoint. After then there's the question mark, and after that one we have all of the query parameters. So each of these query parameters is basically a key value pair. So you have a term and the actual value for this property. They are combined with an and sign. For example, the entity equal to album means that the data we are fetching are albums. We could also have here songs or movies. Okay, so we have two things to combine, this query parameters and this base URL. The main URL. So what we are using is URL components. The initializer that I'm using is from string, because this allows me to use the string that value as the base URL string. This would be a base URL being until here. So sometimes you only In some cases, you only take this part as the base and that is the endpoint, but I'm having here only one endpoint, so I don't overcomplicate things. Base URL. And this let components. This components has one property, which is URL, and it's returning an optional URL. So I could return this URL in this function, URL optional, because again, it's not sure if it can actually construct if we are fulfilling the requirements properly. Now this would simply give me the base URL, but I want to add these query parameters. And the components does have a query items array, URL query items that we're going to use. So this is a let query items, where I can generate an URL query item with name and value. This is the same as I said here, term, this is the name, and the value, this one. So for example, in order to generate this, I would use term and then the search term. This would be 1. Then creating another query item. You can add as many as you want to. We have entity of type album. Then another one, URL query item for limit, which is in this case 5. And I actually did create here a property that sets that I should use for this. So I'm using the string of my limit value, which is a number. And so we are here, and now I have to add the offset. URL query item for offset, and this is actually calculated by the page. So it's this calculation, the page times the limit. So this is the string of this offset integer. A little bit of formatting. And now that I have this, I can actually add these query items to my components, which means that I have to make this a var because it's not changeable. Okay, now it seems to work, and we can test this out. So where did I generate this? So this is this part here. Instead of creating the URL from the string value, I'm saying create URL for search term, and I actually move the offset there, so we don't need to do this. Okay, let's run and pray. Maybe I should also print, or maybe I'm just going to print also the URL. So this is URL.absolute string. Okay, I look for John, and the URL that it uses is like so. So you see, we do have this correct formatting of having here this question mark when the query parameters are started, and then it always uses the term equal sign and these end signs in between. We are successful in creating this URL, and we also get the right data. This is very convenient of creating URLs, especially if they get a little bit more complicated, or if you, let's say, have queries that you only sometimes do, like adding here this limit. Maybe you want to have here an option. This function would have an optional limit, and you would only want to add this term if it's actually a limit, if it's not nil. You can also add query items if you have something to add. In order to do the same for entity, for the app that we are building, there's 3 different entities: album, songs, and movie. I mean, this is the entity types that I am actually looking at. So maybe we should make this a little bit more reusable. You can create an enum of type. Okay, I'm going to add this at the beginning here also, and we have to decide if we leave it or not. This is the entity type. So we have 3 cases of album, song, and movie. And I need to have the string value, so I'm using here string, and now it gives me the string value. The raw values will be strings. so that in the input arguments for this create URL function, I can give the type. This is of type entity type, and I can say the default is album. And then I can use this instead of the entity's value. So this is the type's raw value, which means that we can also we could now use the same function here to search for songs or albums with very little effort in creating this. It's a very handy little way of dealing with all these different URL query thingies. The next thing that I want to talk about is the fact that although I can now create URLs for different entities, when I am getting the data back from my URL session, the data will be of different types, and I would need to modify this code, and in particular the way I'm decoding this. The other part is mainly when I have decoded this data, I have something, then where do I put it on which properties, and how do I update the properties in this view model that are used in the UI, like the album, if my search state was good or not, or if I'm still loading, if I had an error. So I want to make this function more reusable. And the thing that, as I said, I actually need to generalize is this decoding type here. And in order to create this function, one thing I need to deal with is the fact that I have here different sources of errors, which I don't really like. I need to have some kind of generalized error where I can say, okay, I have different error cases of either I have a URL error, I have a decoding error, or something is wrong with or I do get a bad response back. Maybe maybe the URL that I actually sent doesn't exist. For example, if I change this search or if I change my base URL to searches, I will be able to create this URL, but it will return me a bad response of this is not existing, this web page. And that's what we have to look into in this response parameter. So I want to generalize the error, and that's why I need to create an error type. So maybe we're going to add this to the models folder. This is a Swift file because it's the type, and I'm naming this API error. It is an enum AP because I said we have different cases of errors that can occur. API error. This is conforming to error. This is error is actually a protocol. If you conform to the error protocol, you can actually use these errors for throwing. Maybe I don't go too much into detail, but it's basically the generalized error type. Okay, then I said we have different error cases. Okay, I'm opening the API error next to my view model so we can look through what I actually did here. So when I call this fetch albums function, I first check if I actually should start the fetch request. If I don't have anything to search, I don't start. And if I'm already loading, I would also not start. So this is stopping this requests depending on the situation I am. This has nothing to do with actual errors. Then the next part is here I try to create this URL. And in case I don't have a URL, maybe I don't want to, like in our case, or in the case I just showed you, nothing happened and I just didn't know what was going on. Maybe I want to throw an error so I get feedback, which means that I should have the case of bad URL. It's always good to leave some traces for yourself so you know what you did, what happened. Then the next case is the case where I have a URL error. So this is error that is returned in the URL session closure. URL session. And in this case, if you want to pass down the error that I actually got from the URL session, because the information is in here, I can also pass this further. This is a URL error. Optional because maybe I don't have anything. Then I can have a bad response. This is what I said if the endpoint, if the server says your URL doesn't make sense. So this is bad response. And the information we are getting from this response, the one that I actually care is the response, the status code. So this is an integer. Okay, we went through these, and then the last one is here when I have some problems with my decoding. So this is decoding. And again, I do get here an error that I might like to keep. So this is again then a decoding error. And then in case I don't really know, I'm just going to add a unknown. If you saw here that I used this error.localized description, and this means that this is the localized description that I showed to the user, and in case you want to write this yourself, you need to override the description property, or you need to define a description property, or actually the localized description property too. And in order to be allowed to do this, you need to conform to custom string convertible, because now you're saying I take care of this description thingies. Now it's complaining because we're actually not doing what we are saying, so I can just add here fix. And it asks for a description property. Maybe I'm going to do this afterwards. This is going to be a computed property. So I can say switch stuff, because this definitely depends on whatever I have here. So you can return different strings. Actually, you don't need to have, because this description is the one that we are using for debugging. So that one should be a little bit more clear. So this is bad URL. Then we have a return of URLSession error. And okay, it generated this a little bit weirdly, so I named this error. So this is error.debug. So you see here there's a localized description and debug description. Because this is for debugging, I'm going to use that. So I'm just passing it further when we print this. Then return just bad response. And I'm adding here the status code. So this is bad response with status code. Return, then I have the decoding error. This is the one that I heard quite interesting with this API, because it has always some problems. Decoding error okay, I just use the decoding error because that will print the error description or the debug description. And return unknown error. Then the other one was this localized, actually this one. So we can also do the same localized description string, which I then can use to show on the UI. Again, the same thing. But in this case, we probably don't need to give the user too much information. You can simply use the decoding errors. If you have an error, you can use the localized description for them. So this is returning the URL error localized description, because this also has the what went wrong. I mean, this will have information if there's, for example, no internet connection. Something went wrong. Maybe we don't give something for the response. So can also just use here something went wrong. And the same here. Okay, the same here. So I can also bundle this cases. So I don't need to repeat myself too often. Okay, I don't use this. I can just ignore it with an underbar. Okay, this was it for the error. And now we can use this. I'm going to have to write another function here. So this is fetch. And because I said we need to... This is very similar to my fetch albums. This function, I need to know the URL, optional, and the completion handler. I have to use a completion handler because this is returning something asynchronously. Later, it's a long-running task. And this is an escaping closure to make it nicer to read. So we're returning here something. And in this case, I'm using the results type. This has two cases, the good one when we have data, and otherwise the failure one where we can return whatever error occurred. So this needs to be of the type we want to decode and our API error. Now I also need to define here this type. So I actually need to have for the decoding. I need to give here an input parameter for the type. And this is also related to whatever it is here in the results. So I need to use generics with functions. And the way it's declared is after the function name before the brackets. You have to say in triangular brackets, you can define the generic type. So for example, now I can say the type that I actually have here is t.type. And that is the same that I return here. This is the type. Okay, maybe I just close this. And I forgot to say that I don't return anything. So I need to finish my closure. And I did also define the results type wrong. So this is again in this triangular brackets. Okay, now let's write this. So we basically, with this generic, I was able to say, okay, yeah, I need to use this for this whatever, because I need to say, I want to make the generic what I'm returning. So I'm just saying, yeah, it's some type of t. And this is also the same as I give here in this argument for type. Now, what I wanted to actually do is use this URL fetch request. So maybe I'm going to copy some of these and then clear the parts that we don't need. So all the stuff that are in dispatch queues and print statements I'm going to delete, because this is related to me debugging and using it for the rest. So first it's complaining that URL is of type optional. We don't like this. So first I should actually check if my URL is correct, and otherwise I can return with an API error of bad URL. So God let URL of type URL, else I'm creating my own error of API error dot bad URL. And now I need to call this completion to give feedback upwards to whoever called this. This is completion, and it expects what you see here, a results type. This is because I said this here. So I have to say results. This is of type result, which is like an enum with two cases, failure and success. And this is the failure case. And I'm going to add here my error and then return. Okay, so this URL error here now left. I also don't need to have here this weak self. Okay, let's go through all of these cases. If I have an error, I can do the same. I finish here, or I complete with a error, with a failure, returning here my error. Now this is complaining because it's not an API error. So I need to create an API error with URLSession and then using this error. And this is a general error, but I'm more interested in I get more information if I cast this as an URL error, which it should be. So URL error. So if I have an error that I can cast as an URL error, then I complete with this failure. Next, I want to actually check the response. Else if let response is the response. And this is again the same problem. I get more information when I cast this as a HTTP URL response, because this has the status code that I need to check. And it is good for values between 200 and 299. Usually the default is 200. So this is a range that is good, and we want to we need to check if our response, the status code, is contained in this array. So this returns true or false. And in this case, I'm actually saying it's true when this is containing, but actually I want to here return with an error. This is 3 dots for a proper range. And actually I only should do this if I'm not in this range. Then I know I have a problem or an error. So again, I return here, or I complete early with a failure result of an API error. But in this case, it's the bad response. And I just want to pass further my response to status code. Okay, now I returned already 3 failures and it's time to return something good. Now when I decode this, I need to give the type. So I wanted to actually give here t, or actually I wanted to use the type property that I added. And if this is successful, I can finally complete with a result of success and return here my result. But I get another error and then tells me that this T doesn't conform the decodable. This is one thing of generics, because now I just said, I basically declared here something of name T that doesn't do anything, that cannot do anything. And we just need to say, yeah, but it actually, we need to promise at this point, it actually is decodable. So we can say T is decodable. And this is solved. Now the last completion is if I can catch a decoding error. Completion, results, failure, decoding, and this is an error S. This is again not a decoding error, but I want to know. I didn't define this as an optional because it's complaining that this is an optional. So let's just go to the API error and make this an optional. Okay, now this is accepted. This is the reusable function we can use for all of those types. And I want to start using it here. So this is fetch. So after I created my URL, or basically I can here create a URL with this search term, and then I can call fetch albums, or actually fetch with this type. So I want to use the album results type dot self, the URL that I have here, and then this completion. This is of type result, as it's like an enum. So result case success let results, and case failure and let error. Okay, so now I need to check what I actually did. So this is loading. I can actually set directly, and the rest was just some strings. Okay, let's have a look what I did. In case I had here errors, I usually use them to set it on my state. And I need to use this because I'm going to put all of my properties on published vars that I use in the UI. I need to have this dispatch queue.main. I'm going to just put this outside of my switch statement. I don't have to deal with this all. So now in case I have an error, like here when I had this URL error, I can simply say self dot, okay, and I need to use weak self. Then I had here another error. I don't need to take care of this extra. And I had here this, I checked my albums and I updated some stuff. So this I do need to do when I am successful. So this is, the albums are now in the results. Maybe I should have named this differently. This is the same results, and the total values of results are in this results count. This is now much shorter because I only need to think of, okay, if everything went well with my fetch request, I have here albums that I can just update my UI with. If I have a failure, I just set it on my state as the error state. And it's a lot nicer to read than whatever this is. So I'm just going to delete that. And maybe I should test this. Oh, okay, and now I have here a problem. Adding optionals somewhere. So tapping on one of my trendings is loading the list. And just searching for something. So it's still loading perfectly fine and we have everything. The whole reason why I actually wanted to do this is to have these functions reusable. Now the thing is, if I, for example, now want to have a different tab for my songs, and I would need to have a different view for these songs, and I would need to also have a view model, and I want to actually have this function there. So I would like to have the functions that I just created a little bit more separate and a different layer. So I'm creating here a file which is service API service. This is a class, it doesn't really matter, API service, because we don't store much in here. So now I can move my nice functions over there. So first is the fetch function, and then create URL. Now in my view model, I need to actually have this somewhere accessible. So I'm creating here a property, let service. This is an API service. Just need to wait for the errors. So the first one, so there's two errors where I created this URL and this fetch. You can now go and say service.create URL and service, because this, now it's using the functions that I moved over there. Because I'm using it here twice, it's kind of maybe not so good. Maybe I just have one function that does both of these. So if I go in the API service, what I actually want to have is a function fetch albums, and the input argument that is needed is the search term. And I need to do something very similar here with this completion handler. So I'm just going to copy the completion handler definition. Only that in this case, because I know I have albums, I can replace the T with album result. And then when I have here this fetch, I can say album result.self with this URL. And then the completion handler is just passed upwards. And now I need to remove this service because it's in the same file. Going back to my view model, I can now replace this too by saying service.fetch albums for search term, and then the completion. And this is the same as I defined before, just making it a little bit faster for myself later. But there's still something I did wrong. I guess I didn't pass enough parameters. I guess it's because first the entity type is hidden somewhere. So maybe I'm going to take this and place it in my API service at the top level. So it's now easier accessible because I'm going to use it quite a bit. Then the next thing is I need to actually have the page and the limit. So I need to have here page. This is an int. And limit, this is an int. This is now continuing my error problems to the position where I called this. So I basically need to pass the same properties in this fetch albums. So just after the search thing, I'm adding the same. So I can pass this further. And this is limit. Okay, the errors in this file disappear. And I just need to adjust the service fetch albums functions to pass the page and the limit. So you can now search. You can still search, this is working. And this is what we already were able to do in the very beginning. But now I can use these functions, or I can create more functions like this in the API service to fetch something different. For example, I can create a function that fetches songs. And maybe I'm just going to use everything here to customize this. So in this case, I'm not going to fetch album results. I have song results. And there was a URL Maybe I shouldn't use this default type here, just to make sure I always call this. This is type of song. So I'm searching this term for songs on this page with this limit. And then I need to have here a song result. And here also type of album. And the last one that I can do this for is movies. So in this case, I'm returning movie results of type movie, the URL with type movie, and then the movie result. This is great because now I can create another view model for my songs and one for my movies. So let's do this. It's a Swift file. This is song list view model. Class song list view model conforming to observable object, where the goal is to fetch at published var songs. So this is which is an array of song. And in the beginning I don't have anything, so I'm fetching here an empty. So I have an empty array. Again, I use the service. And we can add here the same functions that I had before of fetch songs. And this is using the search term and the state. So I should have this kind of state more for all of these view models, which means that I shouldn't have it in the view model. So I'm going to take this and move it in my models as a file. And then, oops, this is state. Maybe I should have renamed this to fetch state. Pasting this in here, and then I rename this. This is simply because state can be whatever. So this is fetch state. Okay, this was the... Okay, I can also just remove this print statements. So I want to have the pages limit, the fetch state, and the search term. Okay, maybe I should have just copied this. So the search term, the songs. Okay, I'm going to first show the at published because the service is actually private. I didn't actually make anything private or public so far. Okay, now I have all the properties that I did before. And just going to do the same here. So I'm going to have a function fetch songs for search term. I'm doing the same, only searching when I have something. And instead I'm using here the fetch songs function for my service layer, which means that I get here songs back that I can use to add to my songs array. Okay, this is pretty much it. Just going to do the same for movies. Movie list view model. Copying the whole declaration because I don't really want to change here too much. So this is an array of, the thing I want to fetch is movies. Movie. And now I use the services function for fetch movie, which means that the result is movies. So I'm going to add all these movies to my movie property. And the rest is the same. Okay, maybe I should have changed the name to movies. So, and now we want to take advantage of this. And I'm probably going to have some errors. Very likely, because I didn't test my models for movie and song. When I look back at the app, we actually have a different tab for movies. And it's basically just showing different categories of movies. So let's just add this for now in a tab view. So I have here my view group. Maybe I'm just going to create subviews for movie and album and song, because there's going to be a lot more views now that we finished the networking stuff. So these are for album, and I wanted to do some stuff with the movies. So I created another view for movie list view. So this needs to have a add state private var view model where I can fetch movies. This is the one we created for movie list view model. So because I want to use this anyway in a different tab, I can just use the navigation view with a list. Actually, it's pretty much the same as this. So I'm just going to copy the whole body and we replace some of this stuff. So again, I have a search term, and actually this placeholder is fine. Only maybe I should have, can still use it. Maybe I should rename it. What I don't have is a list of the movies, because this is actually, okay, I should be consistent with my names. So this should be actually the movie list view. So I can rename this to movie search list view. And then another file for movie list view. Similar to my album list. So just going to copy this into my movie list view. You don't need to have everything generic, especially because I'm only trying something. We probably want to customize this a lot more. So this is the view model. In this case is a movie list view model. So I have here movies. So for each of these movies, I want to show something different. Maybe the movies country. Okay, we should use the URLs for the images at some point. There should be a track name, track censored name, track name. I guess this is the title. This is the same. Okay, now it's complaining. It doesn't have a load more because it didn't implement this. And my movies are not identifiable. So many problems. Okay, I have to make this here identifiable. And I'm going to create a var id int return the track ID. So I'm going to use here the track ID. Now my movie list view should get a little bit more happy. And I use the load more. I need to add the load more stuff. Okay. Just going to copy the same function. Fetch movies. And I actually forgot the initializer, so I can actually connect the search thingy. So this whole stuff. But now I have to set my movies empty and I have to fetch movies. And I need the combine stuff. Maybe I should just complete everything and customize some of this. We're going to change some of this. It's not just it might look like I didn't do too much. My preview in the movie list view. Just going to initialize here something. And the same in my movie list view. It's this. I didn't rename this. Okay, I need to, because this is the file I renamed for movie list view. So I know I had the same two preview files, which causes always a problem. And in my this is not correct. This is the movie list view with this view model. This is more a test. At least it's building. And now I can add this movie search in another tab. So my content view, which is very boring until now gets a tab view with content. So the two screens I want to have is these albums and the movie search list view. I did not rename them properly. This one should be the movie search view, not list anyways. So this is a tab item with a label of albums. And I need to find an image. And a tab item with label. This is movies. And an image. Okay, maybe start by music note. okay, maybe I use the Movie Note TV and Movies, TV, just the TV. Okay, in this case I only use Music Note for the Albums tab and TV for the... And this actually have to be system images. Otherwise it's looking in the assets. Okay, the difference is now I have 2 tabs down here. One for albums and one for movies. And I actually didn't change much. Maybe I should at least change the title properly. This comes from copy paste. So in my movie, I'm changing this now to search movies. This is simply an example of how to do this. So now I'm in the albums, I go in the movies. I'm adding here a breakpoint just to check if I do something. Okay, it's going in this function. This is good. I add another breakpoint after my results come back. So on line 50. And press the play button. Okay, what is my... I have a failure, obviously. A failure error, which is a decoding error. I'm just going to press the play button. And I don't get anything back. Going in the fetch movies. I'm adding the breakpoint here just to see the URL. Okay, it's creating this. I'm just going to copy the URL to see if that was a problem. Yeah, I don't get anything back. Okay, and the problem with this is the API's quirkiness. For movies, you shouldn't have here this page and limits. So I can make them optional. And then I'm making this QueryItems var. So if let page is page and let limit, so that now I know I have something. So I can calculate this offset. Then I can say QueryItems.append, and only then I'm adding here the value for limits and the value for offset. .append and then the other one. So you see how to do these optional query items. I have to propagate this further where I use this. So for my movies, I'm going to change this. I'm passing here nil for the pages and nil for limits, which means I don't need to have them in the function call, which I then have to change in my fetch. Okay, so in this case, all of these calculations of pages and limits doesn't make sense, so I might as well delete these. And we're using the default ones. So I remove this pages stuff. And I actually don't need to consider here. And this date is always just good. This is not ideal. I would have preferred the other solution, so try again. Going back to my debug and my breakpoint. And sure enough, I have another decoding error. Actually, I should have just printed this. That's the problem. This should be a print statement. With just the debug description or the description. Yeah, the description we wrote. So go to the movie tab, Rammstein. And then I can see here the release date. This is the same errors that I had before. So movie type. This is a string. Short is no key for short description, so this is also an optional. So this is a string optional. Again, this is the problem with this API. Coding a preview URL should also be optional. Maybe just go for all of the optionals. Unfortunately, it only gives you one error each time, so you have to go through this a couple of times. Collection price is also optional. So this is a double optional. And the track price is also optional. And the track time millis is also optional. This might also be different for different points, so maybe you need to adjust this later also. Unfortunately, bad documented API. Okay, so I did get 50, just didn't place them correctly. And actually, because I don't have here anything more, I might as well just assign the movies. So this is self.movies is movies. Oh, so this is the results. Results. I have too many results names here. I definitely need to change this. And I get 8, and you don't see this loading indicator or any funny things. So this is working fine. They're also independent, these tabs now. Here you can still search for songs, and the movies tab still has the old search. So we have this independent searching for different types, which we then can use in the next section when we do finally the fun stuff, which is implementing the whole UI, like the grids and stuff. So, for example, we can then continue. Instead of having these different tabs for each section, we can have a picker where we decide which of this list to show. For this, we need to change quite a bit, actually. And we can also use the all state, or we can also say, yeah, look for all, and then we show different sections. And as you see, we need to have all of this kind of grids and layouts. So we are finally going to do some fun stuff in the next part. Thank you for sticking around until this point. Well done. In case there is something open, please leave a comment. Or if you have some improvement suggestions, you can also discuss this. Until next time, happy coding.